Hello Varlets. This video is going to be a sort of testing ground for a new format of review that I've been working on. You're going to see some new additions to my weapon reviews which I've not included before, all in an attempt to make them more understandable and useful. With this video, we're going to be taking an in-depth look into the Force Greatswords, exploring what makes them great, how best to build them, and some tips on leveraging the weapon to its fullest potential, especially the Force Cleave attack. If you find the information here useful, please consider sharing them with your buddies and fellow siblings too. Now, let's kick things off with the weapon profile. The Force Greatswords are versatile melee weapons which give Psykers the capability of mowing down hordes of chaff enemies while dealing with bigger elites effectively in a single package. Although not the most mobile of weapons due to its low dodge distance and effective dodge count, the Force Greatswords almost act as a one-man army sort of weapon with its Force Cleave special attack, giving you horde clearing power beyond the reach of any regular melee weapon. As for its damage profile, taking a glance at the damage tables of all the attacks on both Greatswords, and you immediately observe that these weapons are designed for finesse attacks, striking at weak spots and scoring critical hits. At the very least, weak spots and crits deal almost 90% more damage than body shots, going as high as 150% more damage for some attacks. Now, there are some attacks which have noteworthy profiles to keep in mind. The first is the heavy attack profile of the Mark 6. Both these attacks deal heavy damage to enemies, but what is interesting is that a single combo of these two attacks to weak spots will kill every single elite and specialist that isn't carapace or unyielding without any upgrades or talents. This knowledge informs us a bit on how we are going to want to build this great sword. The next profile is a hidden one. It is the profile of the push attack into the heavy thrust of the Mark 8. This attack is not mentioned in-game, but I've taken the time to map out the damage and compare it to the other profiles. At first, you might assume that because it has the same attack animation as the heavy thrust from the Mark 6 that it shares the same damage. However, this is not the case. As you can see from the comparison here, the Mark 8's heavy push attack deals 18% more damage than the already hard-hitting heavy 2 of the Mark 6. It is by far the strongest damaging hit across all the damage profiles of the Great Swords, and is the strongest heavy attack of the Mark 8. This informs us on how we might want to fight with the Mark 8. Speaking of fighting, let's take a look at the attack combos for both weapons. When it comes to the Mark 6, there are actually a bunch of combos that involve overriding the 4th flight attack, which is meant to be a single target strike down. The first way is to override the 4th flight attack with a heavy attack. This chains your light 1, 2, 3 into a left-right diagonal slash, which you can then reset with your light 1, 2, 3 again and repeat. The second is to block cancel after your light 1, 2, 3. This resets your attack chain entirely and puts you back to the start of the light attack chain. The last is to chain your light 1, 2, 3 into a push into a horizontal light slash. This attack has the same damage profile as your light 1 attack for additional horde clear. However, doing this causes your very next attack to be the single target strike down. But because you have initiated a push beforehand to stagger enemies, the penalty of having a strike down attack in your horde clear chain is lessened. After this, the attack chain resets back to the start. While I have gone over some of the most common horde clear attack combos for the Mark 6, the reality of it all is that the natural light attack chain is already pretty decent for horde clear, especially against Poxwalker hordes. All you need to do is incorporate some dodging and be conscious on where in your attack chain you are, and you'll be alright most of the time. However, if you are facing too dense of a horde or dealing with groups of dregs and scab bruisers which have more mass, using the push into light attack slash helps to create some breathing room in between combos by staggering them. I have found doing this to be more practical than remembering all the different combos for horde clear. It feels a lot more natural to me as well. Now, for heavy attack combos, we really only have one for the Mark 6, and it's simply chaining heavy 1 and heavy 2 together in a continuous loop. This combo will be your bread and butter for bringing down elites, specials, and dealing boss damage. Moving on to the Mark 8, this weapon has pretty much just one combo for horde clearing, spamming your entire light attack chain. Since all your attack patterns are either horizontal or diagonal slashes with cleave and loops itself entirely, it's a very accessible weapon to fight hordes and groups of enemies with. In exchange for a much simpler and accessible horde clearing chain, the Mark 8 has a weaker natural heavy attack chain. It opens with a heavy slash, which then chains into 2 overhead strikes H2 and H3, which then loops itself infinitely until you reset the attack chain. The first heavy slash is actually meant for horde clearing more than it is for single target damage. The 2 overhead strikes have the same damage profile as the one from the Mark 6 and deal a hefty amount of damage. Where the Mark 8 shines is in its push attack into heavy thrust. We saw in the damage profile that this attack is the highest damaging attack across both the Greatswords, and the combo that makes use of this attack flows nicely because it overrides the heavy slash in H1. This combo is not only very damaging, but it's also very safe to use since you initiate a force push to knock enemies to the ground or break them out of their attacks first, leaving them open to be hit by your full combo. So, from the different combos available to the Greatswords, I'd say that more or less they are the same in capability, but the Mark 6 has better accessibility in the single target killing with its heavy loop. Meanwhile, the Mark 8 has an easier time with hordes thanks to its straightforward light chain. Personally, I have different builds that make the most of both the Greatsword's attack chains. This is something I will share with you in another video after this. So, that was it for the attack combo section. I didn't want to make it too complicated by telling you all the possible combos and attack chains you can access with the Greatswords. Odds are, you'll be depending on the ones I've mentioned here the most. Something you may have noticed is that I've included diagrams to help show you what a particular combo looks like and where you are actually swinging from. This was a suggestion from a Discord pal, and he suggested that I learn from the Ogrenomicon to make understanding attack chains more easy. Hopefully, the inclusion of these diagrams have made learning simpler and that you haven't gotten lost in between the different alphabets and numbers. It's still a little clunky, but let me know if there's anything more I can improve when it comes to talking about attack combos. Next up, we have my favorite part of the Greatswords, the Force Cleave weapon special. Upon activating your weapon special, you unleash the warp essence stored within your blade, causing your next attack within the next 3 seconds to release an expanding wave of warp energy that cleaves through everything in its path and staggers enemies hit. The Force Cleave has a maximum range of 28 meters and has a wider reach the further out it travels. The Force Cleave can also go through walls and has functionally infinite cleave, but if there is enough mass in front of you, something like maybe 60 maulers or so, your Force Cleave can actually stop early. When you've activated the special attack, it doesn't matter if your next attack is a light or heavy attack, the damage profile of the Force Cleave is the same. The damage you deal is dependent on how much essence your Greatsword has accumulated when you activate the special attack. The first stage requires 10 essence collected, while the second stage requires a total of 20 essence collected. Essences in between these values will not add any more damage until reaching the next stage. So, if you have 19 essence and you activate the Force Cleave, you'll still only deal stage 1 damage. Keep in mind, after you've activated the Force Cleave, getting hit will cause you to lose the charge. If you haven't spent the charge within the activation window of 3 seconds, you will also lose all essences you've collected. Here is a table to show you the essence value of each enemy and how many kills you need to reach a specific stage. Here's another table to show you how long you can hold on to your essences before it decays and how long they last before they dissipate entirely. Now, while it's good and all to know how many kills you need to reach one stage to another and how much time you have to do so, the big question you probably have about the Force Cleave is how big is the difference between the uncharged attack, stage 1 and stage 2? Is it always worth it building up to the max, or does it make more sense to release it early? To answer this, I've put together a damage profile for the Force Cleave so we can take a look at what's going on underneath. The first thing you'll notice is that the Force Cleave is incapable of scoring weak spot hits. It can only proc critical strikes, which deal 30% more damage than base. Next thing you'll see is that an uncharged attack basically doesn't do much damage at all. At 100 damage across all armor types except for flak and carapace, it would take you 3 uncharged attacks to bring down groaners. Not exactly an effective way of doing things. However, after collecting 10 essence, it reaches stage 1, and the damage output of the Force Cleave increases by 4.5 times. At this stage, it can bring down poxwalkers and groaners easily and also wipe out scab shooters and stalkers. Collecting another 10 essence to reach stage 2 further increases your damage by about 90% from stage 1. At this stage, all normal enemies will be killed by a Force Cleave, and you can even take out some specialist enemies like snipers and scab bombers, I think. What the damage profile tells us is that the Force Cleave is really built to wipe out groups of chaff enemies. Hordes of poxwalkers and groups of shooters and bruisers can be instantly cleaved down with a fully charged up Force Cleave. However, there is one big drawback of the Force Cleave. It has very severe damage fall-off. The numbers you saw on the damage profile is the damage you deal as long as enemies are within 8 meters of you. After 8 meters, the Force Cleave suffers a steep linear damage fall-off, losing up to 90% of its damage by the time you reach 18 meters. This means, beyond 18 meters and up to its maximum range of 28 meters, you're only dealing 10% of your Force Cleave's maximum damage potential. Now this might sound pretty bad, but keep in mind that this is still a melee weapon after all, having what is effectively an instant kill button for hordes that are less than 10 meters away from you is still very strong in the grand scheme of things. And as we'll see in the build section and tips, there are ways of making the Force Cleave stronger than it appears on paper. Next, let's talk about the blessing selection. Here are the blessings available to the Greatswords, and I'm mostly okay with the selections we've got, but I'm kind of disappointed with the unique blessings that appear here. Murderous Tranquility is basically by crack of bone, but requires you to sacrifice a blessing slot. I can see maybe some potential in this. It requires a bit more testing, but I'll work on that. Warp Slice would have been nice, but as we saw from the damage profile, this basically translates into getting an extra 30% damage boost every 15 seconds. Of course, guaranteeing a critical hit means you can activate things like Metal and Perfect Timing, but I don't think it's worth taking it just for that. The biggest letdown of this blessing is that it doesn't interact with Blazing Spirit, so you can't guarantee a Force Cleave that sets everything on Soul Blaze, which would have been a very cool combo to have. In my opinion, there are only 5 blessings here worth taking, and one of them is a definite anchor blessing for all Greatsword builds, and that is Precognition. A 60% finesse boost to a weapon which has insanely high finesse already often will reduce your breakpoints across all enemies by 1 attack. This is huge for dueling against chunky enemies like Crushers and Maulers, and is a vital blessing that helps you reach the 2-shot breakpoint against these enemies easily. Blessings after Precognition are a matter of personal choice. Naturally, given its high finesse and the use of Precognition as an anchor, critical chance blessings like Riposte and Shred would take further advantage of the Greatsword's combat strengths. Another blessing to consider is Wrath for the increased cleaving power. This blessing makes mowing down hordes even easier, affording you the cleaving power to build up to 20 essences faster for a stage 2 Force Cleave. Depending on your overall build and the intent you have for your Greatsword, the usefulness of Wrath may be limited in some cases. Finally, we have Unstable Power, where you gain extra strength based on how much peril you've built up. This is the only other blessing in the pool that grants additional damage for the Greatswords, and its usefulness will depend on your overall build crafting and if you're able to maintain a high peril playstyle. Unstable Power is my personal blessing of choice because of how I've chosen to play with the Greatswords. As long as you have Precognition in your build, whichever of the other blessings you choose to slap on is up to you. Play with what feels nice or suits your own needs. Moving on, we have Perk Selection. So, for this section, I've been working on a breakpoint calculator that takes into account not just perks and blessings, but also character talents and talents of your other teammates. What you see here is a simpler version of that, and it's still very much in a work in progress, so this version here is good enough for me to see which combination of perks is going to be the most useful, assuming you don't have any other talents that boost damage in any way, and if Precognition is active or not. However, you can see that I've included Kinetic Presence as a variable. That's because I wanted to see if the aura choice would have an impact on breakpoints, given that it's essentially a tier 3 plus elite damage perk that is on all the time and whether or not it will ultimately be worth incorporating into your build. I won't bring you through all the math and permutations that I've tried, instead I'll summarize what I found in some tables later. So, given the damage profile of both the Greatswords we saw earlier, we only need to focus on bringing down Carapace and unyielding enemies. Everything else dies in 2 hits to the head before precog is even active. Question is, which combination of Carapace, unyielding and elite damage is the most useful for each of the Greatswords, given the attack combos you are using to bring these enemies down? I have put together the following tables of data after analyzing the results from my calculator for each of the different marks. For the mark 6, the most effective combination, given no other talents, is the combination of elite damage and Carapace, assuming you are using the heavy 1 into heavy 2 loop. What this table tells us is that against Crushers and Maulers, the combination of Elite and Carapace allows us to bring our breakpoints against them down by 1 attack. If we manage to activate Precognition before our first strike and get at least 2 attacks within the 2-second window, we reduce the breakpoints against Crushers and Maulers by another 1 attack. So if your Psyker has no damage buffs available save for Precognition, best case scenario with this combination of perks is that you 3-shot Crushers and Maulers. But if we also happen to have Kinetic Aura present, or at least another 6% damage from somewhere, we can 2-shot Maulers with precog active, which is a very easy thing to do. As for unyielding enemies such as Bulwarks and Reapers, here is the breakpoint table given the same conditions as Carapace. As you can see, the combination of elite damage and unyielding only moves the breakpoint of Reapers down by 1. Bulwark breakpoints still remains at 4 hits. But if you look further to the right, just having elite damage, Kinetic Aura, along with activating Precognition, allows you to reach the same 3 breakpoints against Bulwarks without having to invest in unyielding. And if you see the column next to it, even if you fully invest in all the boosts, which includes unyielding as well, you'll still only reach a 3 hit breakpoint against Bulwarks. So while being able to 2-shot Reapers is nice and all, the value of bringing Crushers and Maulers down quicker is a lot more important for a melee weapon. For the Mark 8's perks, the recommendations are going to be a little more different given the nature of the weapon's attack combos and the window of opportunity precognition has to shine when facing elite enemies. So for these calculations, we'll assume that precog only has enough time to be activated for the push heavy thrust attack, since you need to activate the force push after the enemy has attacked you for you to dodge, which then eats into precog's timer, hence why you only get 1 attack. Here, we see that just adding carapace damage alone is enough to reduce the breakpoints of both Crushers and Maulers down by 1. The inclusion of elite damage and kinetic aura doesn't do anything more to improve the situation. Because precog only has enough time to be activated for the first strike, at best, stacking all the boosters listed here allows you to reach the 2-shot breakpoint for Maulers. In short, just adding carapace damage gives you the most value given the additional investment needed to reach the next set of breakpoints. As for Bulwarks and Reapers, like Crushers and Maulers, just taking unyielding damage alone gives us the value point of reducing the breakpoints across both Bulwarks and Reapers by 1. Technically, elite damage would have the same impact, but elite damage does not benefit against carapace enemies in any meaningful way. While the combination of both elite damage and unyielding would bring Bulwarks down to 3 hits, you can technically accomplish the same thing with having kinetic presence and precognition, giving us the 3-shot threshold for both Bulwarks and Reapers, while still being able to take carapace damage to reduce the breakpoints for Crushers and Maulers. So, in other words, taking a combination of carapace and unyielding perks, even without precognition active, is going to be the most efficient combination given the most effective attack combo of the Mark 8. And if you can swing it, Kinetic Aura is going to help a lot with pushing the breakpoints of Bulwarks down by 1, and in most cases, even help with reaching the Mauler 2-shot breakpoints. So, to summarize my calculations, for the Mark 6, take Elite and Carapace, and for the Mark 8, take Carapace and Unyielding. Now, it goes without saying that there are limitations to my calculator which I need to further refine for greater accuracy and to be more representative of in-game reality. These recommendations, again, are based on the assumption that you have no other buffs or talents active, which means it would work for every build out there and represents the bare minimum improvement you could achieve with these perks consistently regardless of skill. If you want to play without caring at all about breakpoints and different possible perk and talent combinations for optimization purposes, then my recommendation is just to take Carapace and Unyielding for both weapons and then not think about it anymore. You'll still get good mileage out of this combination. Alright, that was a lot of explaining done for something that is usually very simple. I just wanted to show that my recommendations are backed by numbers and reasonable assumptions that prioritize consistency over higher spikes which assume optimal play every single time, which is something that even the best of us don't do every single moment. Also, I took the time to build the calculator in the past, so I figured I might as well put it to use and show it off a little. Lastly, I have some tips and interactions for you to take away from this video. All of these will be covering the Force Cleave and how best to maximize its potential. Tip number 1 is creating space via dodge sliding backwards. The chief complaint I always observe from players about the Force Cleave is that when they are overwhelmed by hordes, it's difficult to activate the Force Cleave that would solve their problem because they keep getting hit and losing their essences. Positioning is key when using the Force Cleave, and so, by first dodge sliding backwards, you create a small pocket of space in front of you to charge up and then release the attack. If you are in a really tight spot, doing a push into a backwards dodge slide twice might afford you a little more buffer time to get the attack off. While it won't save you 100% of the time, by baking this movement into the activation, you'd be increasing the success rate of getting the Force Cleave off by a good deal. Tip number 2 comes in the form of the stats for your Force Greatsword. The dump stat for these weapons is going to be warp resistance. If you want a build that maximizes the utility of the Force Cleave, then there's a specific level of warp resistance you're going to want to reach along with a combination of talents and blessings. The warp resistance level you want to reach is going to be between 31% and about 50%. The reason why I give a range is because it depends on how many peril resistance nodes you have incorporated into your build. The more of them you have, the lower resistance you're going to need. But for argument's sake, let's assume you have 2 peril resistance nodes in your build. You will then need to have about 35% warp resistance. This is so we can achieve a Force Cleave peril activation cost of at least 42%. 42% peril cost is a very important number for certain builds, and the main reason why you want to reach this threshold is that casting your Force Cleave twice in quick succession puts you at around 84% peril, which is the minimum threshold to reach the maximum stacks of Soul Blaze from Creeping Flames when you activate Venting Shriek. This is a very powerful means of damage output that can be activated very quickly. further bolstering your horde clearing capabilities without having to only depend on having essences built up for your Force Cleave. Tip number 3 is more of an unintended interaction, but it's pretty cool, so I'm going to include it here anyway. While your Force Cleave is travelling out, if you swap to a bolt pistol with the Puncture Blessing, which applies bleed on range attacks, your Force Cleave will apply bleed to all enemies hit as long as you have the bolt pistol out during impact. What you can do with this is spam your Force Cleave, even if it has no essences, and keep swapping back and forth with your bolt pistol. This allows you to apply wave after wave of bleed stacks to all enemies hit, causing a massive amount of damage after 3 applications. Couple this with the Creeping Flames from Vending Streaks tip I just shared, and you can wipe out even waves of elites in hordes. If you are watching this video and it no longer works, that means it's patched out. Tip number 4 is to remember that your Force Cleave has a Stagger component to it. If you are being heavily suppressed by gunners and shooters, especially in Havoc, I have found getting close enough and spamming the Force Cleave at these enemies to break them out of their attack helps my team a lot. You can hit through walls anyway, might as well throw out a couple of Force Cleaves to cause some disruption and stagger to the front lines that you're trying to push into. Well, that's it for my review for the Force Greatswords. I love these weapons a lot, because not only can they handle themselves well as melee weapons, but the amount of interactions and utility it brings as part of its package is just amazing and interesting to play with. That's also part of the reason why I took so long to put this video together. I wanted to test everything possible about these weapons and share them with my dear Varlets, backed by numbers and some new additions of course. I actually have more to talk about these weapons, but I think it makes more sense to talk about them in the context of a specific build which I've been playing with. So stay tuned for my build guides coming out after this video goes live. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one, Varlets.